Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Janis, for having me. I'm very happy to be here. First time in my life in Bretagne, and obviously nobody would go out without the parapluie de Cherbourg, as expected. I have to begin with a confession. I know nothing about the Bible, the Christian Bible, but I was staying in a hotel, and in some hotels they still have Bibles. So I thought I'd take a look to find out what they have to say to me. I opened it. I didn't make this up. I opened the Bible, and this is what I found. Méfiez-vous des scribes qui tiennent à sortir une robe solennelle et qui aiment les salutations sur les places publiques, le premier rang dans la synagogue et les places d'honneur dans le dîner. Brief English translation: beware of scribes, they are vain and good for nothing. So I was wondering whether this was providence and directed at me. I couldn't help it. Anyway, before I knew this, I did my best to not be completely useless and try to think what I could say about the best writing system of the world. How many writing systems are there? That would be the first question to ask, perhaps. How many are there? Obviously, you cannot answer this question without defining what a writing system might be. There are various different answers to this question. We could try to count language-specific writing systems, such as the French writing system or the Greek writing system. That is one way to handle this, and another way would be to differentiate and count types of writing systems, such as logographic, syllabic writing systems, alphabetic or segmental writing systems, abugida, abjad, and featural writing systems. The International Organization for Standardization has to answer this question. We as scholars do not necessarily have to do that, but the ISO has to answer this question. They count presently about 197 different writing systems according to their definition, which says a writing system is any conventional method of representing verbal communication. I have my problems with this definition. I prefer a different kind of definition, which says that writing systems are instantiations of a technology that enhances verbal communication and can usually be interpreted verbally. That is something very different from focusing on representing verbal communication. We can come back to that later. Then the next question, if we go with the ISO of plus minus 200 different writing systems, or if we go to with some other assessments that go up to about 500 in the world, then the question arises, why are there so many? Again, we can think of possible answers. For example, one possible answer is like legal positivism. That is to say, the existence and content of law, of a legal system, depends on social facts and not on its merits. We could apply this to writing systems and say, well, whether good or not, that doesn't make any difference. The main point is the social construction of the system. Another way to answer this question of why are there so many is to say, well, it's like with cars. You like a red one and he likes a blue one. It's a matter of taste, but the basic technology is more or less the same. A third way of answering this question is more interesting and more complicated. It would be to say different systems serve different functions. Again, like cars. You have station wagons, you have family cars, you have two-seaters, you have luxury sedans, and on and on. And therefore, you also have, they serve different functions, right? And maybe that is so also with writing systems. Would that is the last answer that I suggested, would that imply that there is no best writing system? Well, many influential thinkers who have contemplated the nature and differences of writing systems believe otherwise. To cite a well-known example, in his Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel opined that alphabetic writing is in and for itself the most intelligent. Hegel thus recognized a hierarchy of writing systems with the alphabet at the apex. According to him, alphabetic writing preserves the word, mind you, the word, logos, as the crucial unit of thought, more directly and therefore more completely than other not sound-based writing systems. That is his reason for considering the alphabet superior to any other writing system. Without the depth of Hegel's philosophical thinking, the superiority of the alphabet is, in the West, something like common knowledge. After all, God Almighty himself uses the alphabet to spell out the secrets of life. Can anyone seriously believe that our genetic code would be written in Chinese? Hegel's observations, which among others include a critique of the Leibnizian project of treating Chinese writing as a model of universal characters, of the Characteristica Universalis, dates from the 1830s. Leibniz's idea, of course, goes another couple of centuries back. However, almost 2 centuries later, similar ideas about the supreme intelligence of the alphabet are still with us. Look what I found recently. A headline in Foreign Policy, an absolutely reputable periodical, informing me that Chinese is not a backward language. Imagine that. I mean, except that the author when you read the article, that becomes clear quite quickly. The author obviously confuses language and writing, but even if he, and it is an he in this event, were concerned with writing only, this is astounding. That such is newsworthy and has to be dealt with the world. This insight that Chinese is not backward. Who would have thought? The alphabet is a load-bearing pillar of Western supremacism. Take the Greeks, present company excluded, of course. You would hardly find a Greek who is not deeply convinced that the Greek alphabet is the epitome of human, if not divine, creation. There are, of course, exceptions. And I want to share one with you. I really shouldn't deprive you of this one, which is quite noteworthy. This is by someone who was born in mid-19th century on Lefkos, a Greek island, and his name was Patriklos Lefkadios Chern, who made a name for himself as a writer and a journalist as Lafcadio Hearn, and ended his life in Japan as Koizumi Yakumo. When he arrived in Japan in 1890, he kept his notes and put this down in a little article, and from which I quote. Finally, while you are still puzzling over the mystery of things, there will come to you, like a revelation, the knowledge that most of the amazing picturesqueness of these streets is simply due to the profusion of Chinese and Japanese characters in white, black, blue, or gold, decorating everything, even surfaces of doorsteps and paper screens. Perhaps then, for one moment, you will imagine the effect of English lettering substituted for those magical characters. And the mere idea will give to whatever aesthetic sentiment you may possess a brutal shock. And you will become, as I have become, an enemy of the Roma Jikai, that society founded for the ugly utilitarian purpose of introducing the use of English letters in writing Japanese. An ideograph does not make upon the Japanese brain any impression similar to that created in the Occidental brain by a letter or combination of letters, dull, inanimate symbols of vocal sounds. To the Japanese brain, an ideograph is a vivid picture. It lives, it speaks, it gesticulates. And the whole space of a Japanese street is full of such living characters, figures that cry out to the eyes, words that smile or grimace like faces. And I've put this just as a courtesy to our host. He speaks of the ugly utilitarian purpose which nowadays rules almost everything we do. He also speaks of Occidental and Oriental brains, a terminology neurologists and cognitive psychologists would probably nowadays evade if they can, because the risk is that it would be found inadequate on substantial grounds, or perhaps also politically incorrect, because Occidental and Oriental brains, well, that goes at the hardware. And can we really sustain this? Actually, it's an open question. It is not a foregone conclusion that we cannot. Why? Because as children, and in some event as very little children, we start learning to read and write at an age when our brains are not quite mature. So the question is, does the input, is there an imprint? Notice the very appropriate metaphor. Is there an imprint at an early age that conditions people to handle different writing systems when they're grown up? There's a lot of very interesting research, for example, by a colleague with whom I had the privilege to collaborate a couple of decades back, Sasanuma Sumiko, who found that brain lesions caused by accidents affect the different writing systems that the Japanese use differently. What of that? That's a very, very interesting discovery. And research along these lines continues. So rather than put Occidental and Oriental brains aside as just an expression of Lafcadio Hearn's ignorance, who is very unlikely to have known Hegel's Encyclopedia or being well-versed in neurolinguistics, we should take this seriously and look at possible differences. Morphological differences between the brains of different races continue to be investigated, and to what extent maturing brains are shaped by early input, we still do not know, and I think this is legitimate research, although a very fine line divides this from racist science, and one has to be extremely careful about this. Similarly delicate is the concept of teleological evolution of writing systems, which, however, is even much more common. That is taken for granted by many, that writing systems have evolved, and here up on top is the Latin alphabet. 5,500 years after the original inventions, we recognize 4 or 5 original independent inventions nowadays in the Fertile Crescent, in what is now Iraq, in Egypt, in Harappa, in what is Pakistan nowadays, in the Yellow River Valley in China, and in Central America. These seem to have evolved without external influence. All the others are derived, but all the others are still with us. And we could contemplate the question, why have 5,000 years or more not been enough to unify this technology? Do we have other examples? Yes, of course we do. Look, for example, at a related technology, that of calendars. Also original inventions in more or less the same parts of the world. And here what we find is whenever there's true improvement, for example, the Julian calendar here replaced the old Roman calendar because it was more accurate. The calendar, as you know, is the struggle to measure the year. And there are various competing measures that are more or less accurate. And whenever a more accurate procedure had been discovered, eventually it drove out the old one. The Julian calendar, of course, was itself replaced by the Gregorian calendar that we use nowadays in 1582. It took some time, several centuries actually, before especially Protestants couldn't resist the insight any longer, because unfortunately the Gregorian calendar, called so after Gregor XIII, the Pope of Rome, which made it unappetizing for Protestants, but eventually they had to give in and adopt the Gregorian calendar, which is nowadays obviously used around the world. Another example, numerical notation. Take a thing such a primitive thing as 42. If you know nothing, you can still just write 44 strokes in a row and then count them off. Not a very efficient kind of notation. Chinese numerals, you write 4, 10, 4. But you have to learn, of course, that this means not, for example, 4,004 or 404, but it means 44. That you have to be taught. It is not self-evident. Roman numerals are just incredibly complex to understand. You write 10, 50, 1, 4, 1, 5, and are supposed to understand that this means 44. Ridiculous. You have to turn things around and have them turn around again. So how did we get rid of these cumbersome systems? The basic insight was that nothing is something. And that is an insight that comes out of Indian philosophy. The nothing between these two fours. There's nothing between them, right? But it is something, namely the position. The zero with the placeholder system is a breakthrough. The invention of the zero in India and the dispersion of Arabic, what would in Europe are usually called Arabic numerals, was unstoppable. Why? The answer is obvious. The system is better. It's superior. Try to make a calculation, a simple calculation that a third grader can do with Chinese or Roman numerals. That's all but impossible. So here we have a clear example of a notation system which has been improved by path-breaking inventions. Could we ask a similar question about writing systems? Has there been a point where an insight revolutionized the way we handle written symbols? That raises the question of standards. What are we looking at? What should a writing system be good for? For example, good for visual discrimination to the human eye rather than to dog's eyes or goldfish eyes. Goodness in aesthetic terms. Clearly, people will tell you there's writing systems that are more beautiful than others. Arabic calligraphy, for example, is much more beautiful. Most people agree than medieval manuscript handwriting. Good in terms of cognitive processing. Are some writing systems easier to process cognitively than others? Next point, very important, linguistic fit versus ease of transfer. That could be a balance. Are all writing systems easily suitable for all languages? Can they be transferred from one language to another easily? That would seem to be a rather important criterion for the evaluation of writing systems. Ease of learning is another important consideration, because at least nowadays, maybe not in the past, but nowadays, people tend to believe that it is good when many people are able to read and write. So we want ease of learning. Economy could be and is usually interpreted as parsimony of the basic inventory of signs. I'll come to that in a minute again. Also, a criterion very often adduced to evaluate writing systems. Finally, continuity of tradition. It shouldn't, but it does count for much, actually. So can we evaluate writing systems on the basis of this catalog of criteria? It's not an easy question to answer. Mind you, and I did this, of course, on purpose, remember the ugly utilitarian purpose that Lafcadio Hearn pointed out. This is the one criterion on the basis of which writing systems have been evaluated, notably by Ignaz Gelb, the well-known expert of writing and Semitic languages. He bases his teleological idea of describing writing systems purely on economy. It is called a little bit differently, using a term by George Kingsley Zipf, who called that the principle of least effort. The principle of least effort means people are lazy. If you want more elaborate wording, then you can say that whatever the task, human beings tend to minimize the probable average rate of their work expenditure over time. That's another way of saying lazy. So parsimony is the principle that Gelb adduced, and we can recognize that, of course. For example, if we look at cuneiform writing, in Akkadian we had about 1,000 distinct signs, plus 500 variants, give and take a few hundred. And the average wedge per sign rate was 10. 1,500 years later, Old Persian, the inventory had been reduced to plus minus 50 characters, so drastically reduced, and the wedge sign ratio was down to 3.7. So a reduction of the inventory and a reduction of the complexity of individual signs. Similar development we can recognize when the Japanese tried to come to grips with the Chinese writing system. They reduced complexity drastically. And these columns on the right-hand side you see Chinese characters, and on the left-hand side you see the syllabic characters derived therefrom, and once again you see a huge reduction in complexity, as well as a reduction in the total number of signs. The number of signs is just 50, whereas the number of Chinese characters goes into the thousands, okay? So the same tendency of parsimony in the course of time. With Egyptian, it's, since the pictorial character has been preserved much more faithfully than in Chinese, it is more difficult to count strokes. But one thing is very clear. The Egyptian alphabet, which had been there already in 1800, before our count, is hugely more simple than classical Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. That distinguishes, once again, plus minus 900 different characters, as opposed to a few more than 20 characters of the Egyptian alphabet. So there is this tendency of complexity reduction. However, in a sense, this law of the principle of least effort also applies to Chinese characters, in the sense that there are very many low complexity characters and very few characters with a high number of strokes. So this is a regular distribution across the system, which we can find also, for example, in lexicon. High-frequency words are short, low-frequency words are long. That is basically what this shows, and we can demonstrate this, that this holds across languages and across writing systems, though there is, in other words, the force of reduction of effort at work. But is it the only one? After all, we have, the Japanese have had their simple 50-character, most suitable system of writing for more than 1,000 years, and they continue to use Chinese characters. The Egyptians had their alphabet and continued to use hieroglyphic writing for another 3,000 years. So we have to come up with additional explanations. Now, if you compare, for example, the 6 official languages of the United Nations, you discover very quickly that the Chinese text is always the shortest. That is also a kind of economy. And then we can, of course, also ask ourselves, is parsimony everything? Now look at this. For just such a dumb little syllable as biang, come up with a character that counts, I try to count, 55 strokes. Actually, I meant to make a little test here, and I can. But in this digital world here, we are deprived of handwriting implements. I was going to ask someone in the audience who does know Chinese characters to just write it down for me. You may think that it takes forever to learn such a character. Now, we can still do the impromptu test. Would you be willing to do this, Professor Honda? Okay, so the test is this. Let me ask you, have you ever seen this character before? Okay, well then, you're too honest. Now, I thought that because this character is not used in Japanese, still, after looking at it for about 10 seconds, he would undoubtedly be able to write it down, even though it consists of 50 plus strokes. But then, since Professor Honda is too honest, you'll just have to take my word for it. This is not as complex as you might think. But is it not also beautiful? I mean, spending 55 strokes for one cheap syllable, biang, doesn't it look like a plate full of spaghetti? Actually, it means noodles. Which brings me to the question of how we should actually count the inventory of characters of a writing system. Now, in order to be able to handle Chinese or Japanese, you need plus minus 2,000 characters, 2,500 characters in common use in China, 2,100 in Japanese, where you also use the other writing systems. That looks like a lot. However, easy as ABC is just a myth, because in order to be able to write and read English fluently, you have to master about 1,800 grapheme-phoneme combinations. Otherwise, you will mispronounce or misspell. Now, and the deceiving nature of the Roman alphabet makes you believe 26 characters perfectly fine. It's not. So why not learn Chinese in the first place? Which, notably for English, would be absolutely fine. Since English has no morphology to speak of, you might as well use a meaning-based or meaning-directed kind of writing system. It isn't so easy, in other words, to count characters or to assess the goodness of writing systems. Now, speaking of transfer, how to apply different writing systems or transfer writing systems to different languages, a good example of the misfit is Latin alphabet for Vietnamese. The Vietnamese were lured into the trap of the alphabet at a time early in the 20th century when they for a moment hated the Chinese more than the French. And they switched then from Chinese to French, whose missionaries told them that, yeah, easy as ABC. Easy as ABC in Vietnamese is clearly dysfunctional because you have 5 A's and 5 other vowels, 5 E's and so forth. It's just a total mess. And by no means economic. Now, I've been shown the clock. Is there a best writing system? The answer, yes. Absolutely. Korean is the best, Korean Hangul is the best writing system in the world in many regards. I mean, if what you can see here is that a writing system is far from being a representation of speech. It is an imposition on language. What is a vowel? What is a consonant? Nothing. Handling tones as diacritics is an imposition on the structure of Vietnamese. Tones do not go with vowels. Tones go with syllables. That is true of all tone languages. So treating vowels as units that take a tone. Well, you may remember that in Europe, scholars used to speak of Semitic alphabets as deficient writing systems, because they do not mark vowels, not in a way that is comparable anyway to the Latin alphabet. This is the mindset. So you use a unit which is not in the language, namely a vowel without tones that doesn't exist in Vietnamese. And then you put a tone mark on top. This is a very good illustration of the fact that writing systems, rather than derive structure from the language, impose structure onto it. The great advantage of the Korean alphabet is that it combines these two. It represents as graphic units syllables to fit traditional writing in Chinese. However, the analytic depth of every syllable that is represented goes down to the level of segments and even features. So you have analytically a featural system, synthetically a syllabic system. Plus, it has many other advantages. It is ideologically embedded, as any writing system could be, related to Confucianist philosophy and all sorts of other things, which I cannot go into here. I'll have to skip this and just ask the question, why do we not all use the Korean writing system? Because we are stupid? Or why is that so? Or why do we not use this one? Also, this is especially designed for English, of course, the Shavian alphabet, much superior to Latin. Why do we not use it? Why do we not use a clock like this one? I mean, we have kilometers, we have liters, everything is metric. Why not the clock? Why do we not use a keyboard like this? Actually, our technology permits us to design our own keyboards for our purposes. Very, very few people, maybe some crazy linguists, but very few people do. Rather, they stick to this one, QWERTY. The QWERTY keyboard was originally designed not with any linguistic thought in mind. Well, a little bit, because this sequence of letters, well, not very well, but you know it all because you have it on your own keyboard. It was designed to prevent these keys. The older ones amongst you may remember this kind of implement. The QWERTY keyboard was designed to stop the keys from jamming when you write fast, that it doesn't get jammed. We're still having it here. And why is that? It's because in our behavior and use of technology, we adhere to path dependence. It is difficult, cumbersome, and takes some effort to break out of the path and do something new. So this is basically why we have still so many writing systems. I do not believe, and I could talk about this more, that this is because of the superiority of the Latin alphabet. Why is it distributed more widely in the world than other writing systems? For example, Cyrillic or Greek? Certainly not because it's superior, because Greek and Roman and Cyrillic are isomorphic. They follow the same principles. It's a question of power, of course, and not of merit. And why am I closing with this? What I want to show with this is, with writing systems, it is like with world maps. They are projections. You can never, ever have a faithful mapping of a globe onto a plane. It's impossible. And you can never, ever have a writing system that is in an apparatus of visual signs that maps onto sound waves in a faithful manner. It's a projection. Thank you.
We have some minutes for questions, so if you would like to ask a question, push the button of the mic in front of you. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your talk. I was wondering if you could tell me the name of the collaborator that you had who was investigating brain lesions and its effect on different components of Japanese writing.
Yes, that is Sasanuma Sumiko. She is, I suppose she's retired by now, but she was working in the neurological division of a hospital in Yokohama. And she has published widely about this in Japanese and in English. So Sasanuma Sumiko, you will find publications if you look for it.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. I'm wondering about the Hangul script. You said that is the best writing system of all. But I think the reason why it is the best one, and I agree, is because it is the only one which was invented compared to all the other writing systems that developed. This is a script which was invented, and with this invention, people could really take into consideration everything which is important to write down.
Yes. It's something to make linguists proud.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
They can be happy that, but also in the event, the fact that they weren't ignored by power. After all, it was a king who said, well, I take pity with my people, especially with women who also want to write. So I have to come up with the writing system that is easy enough that even they can learn it within a week's time. So ease of learning we have here. Unfortunately, one has to be honest and say, in the meantime, 500 years have passed, and it shows. It is no longer as simple and faithful as it once was when it was introduced. And this is also interesting to know, simple as and ingenious as it was, the Korean elite ignored it. They continued writing Chinese because, why? Yes, because it threatened their privilege. And it took other political interventions to make the Koreans like their own script. But it is absolutely, as you say, one of the very few examples of a writing system designed at the drawing board. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question on visual discrimination. Can you tell us a little bit more? How do you test them? Which languages? And,
yes.
I have a few examples in mind. But maybe
well, please tell me.
No. The simple example is in Arabic. Some 30 years ago, Professor Lakhdar Ghazal had bettered the design of letters for Arabic letters to be read more easily.
Well, people are still working on this, maybe more than ever today, to adapt various fonts to digital display. But yes, there is research. For example, there has been a lot of research about redundancy. If we take a printed page that is written horizontally, and we blind off half of the line, can we still read it? And we can compare writing systems, which in the event some are easier to read than others. When a writing system is rather dense, such as Hebrew square, the redundancy is lower, and then you lose more if you blind it off. And then you have tests about what is good to the human eye, horizontal, left to right, right to left, or vertical. Almost nothing down up. There are a few, but almost nothing. And with from top to bottom, you have, for example, Tibetan, which is extremely hard to read. Not on account of the direction, but on account of the fact that individual characters are not distinct, or are only minutely distinct. So yes, there are measures, there are experimental studies about goodness in this regard.
Do we have time for one more question?
Thank you, Florian. I was interested in your comment about the basic unit that carries tone being the syllable rather than the vowel, because working on African languages, I consider it rather to be the morpheme that is the basic unit. And to me this is an important distinction because it means that it's meaning rather than sound that is associating to tone. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yes, okay. I completely agree. I mean, if in that context you're talking about designing writing systems for hitherto unwritten languages, all of these considerations come together. How shall we do it? Shall we take syllable signs that have an inherent tonal quality? Or shall we handle them as diacritics? Where shall we put them? And there again, I think past dependency is a strong force. Most widely used Latin, of course. And where in a Latin script shall we put? I mean, there are, especially with click languages, where they use additional characters.
Yes.
Rather than put tone diacritics on vowel letters. That is another option to introduce, to augment the Latin alphabet with additional letters. But I agree with what you're saying.
Okay, thank you very much for that interesting talk. This